Can you name 7 principles of Austrian economics that will help you on the pathway to radical entrepreneurial innovation? Dr. Keith Smith can.
This is Economics for Entrepreneurs, the podcast where we apply the principles of economics to help you start, grow, and manage your business. Here's your host, Hunter Hastings.
Hi, Hunter Hastings here. At Economics for Entrepreneurs, we always delight in hearing from practicing entrepreneurs exactly how Austrian economics has helped them to succeed. These stories can be inspiring, they can be mind-opening, they can be motivational, and I believe we have just such a real-life story today. Entrepreneurs bring change, and they specifically bring change that improves people's lives. A field where such life improvement can be readily observed is healthcare. Health is a number one priority for most people, and the science of healthcare is so advanced that the most formidable problems and challenges people face can be addressed. What would have been thought of as miracles a few decades ago are now frequent and repeated procedures. The Austrian principle of people continuously trying to improve their circumstances is visibly at work in health sciences. Healthcare delivery is another matter entirely. People are quite dissatisfied with current arrangements, indicating a lot of opportunity for innovation. Basic principles are compromised. The first compromise is consumer choice. Virtually every one of us faces highly constrained choices when we're looking for healthcare, from the insurance that is available to us, to the choice of doctors and hospitals, to the choice of pharmaceuticals. Another compromise is free market pricing. There's very little of it. Government regulation, oligopolistic markets, and rigidly structured and heavily layered organizational hierarchies that limit access are all factors in pricing that is high, opaque, and inflexible. Take what is today a relatively simple to perform surgery, hip replacement. The price of this surgery can vary by factors of 2x or 3x or 4x or many, many more. If a hospital bills the surgery to Medicare, the price will be different than if it bills it to a corporate insurer. If a consumer chooses what is called medical tourism and chooses a magnificently equipped new hospital out of the country in, for example, Bumrungrad in Thailand, the price might be 1/6 or 1/8 of what it might be in the US. Or the patient could choose to visit Surgery Center of Oklahoma. First, that patient would visit the website, surgerycenterok.com, and click on the tab labeled Pricing. From a pull-down menu, they'd select the surgery they want, hip. Next, they'd see a range of very precise prices from $5,575 for hip arthroscopy to hip arthroplasty, $15,499. The patient can request the surgeon of their choice from a list. How transparent can you get? On the same website, you'll see Dr. Keith Smith's blog with titles like, "Where there is choice, there's a free market," where Dr. Smith points out that price gouging by big hospitals is their choice. They could choose to build a reputation for themselves by taking complete financial advantage of the vulnerable and the sick. Likewise, they could make a reputation for themselves by being fair and honest and not price gouging the vulnerable and the sick. It's a choice, and patients should be aware of who among suppliers is making what choices. On the website, you'll also see reference to FMMA, the Free Market Medical Association, which describes itself as a movement to accelerate the speed and growth of free market healthcare revolution. What has all this got to do with economics for entrepreneurs? Everything. Primarily, we want you to get to know Dr. Keith Smith, a brilliant pioneering entrepreneur in a field that has traditionally resisted entrepreneurs because it is so regulated and bureaucratic. Dr. Smith has taken the Austrian entrepreneurship approach. He's identified a market need expressed by consumers. He chose the pricing of surgical services as the number one problem in our dysfunctional healthcare system. He did so by empathically listening to patients who find themselves paying more and more out of pocket, and they wanted things to change. He identified the cause of the problem: bureaucracy at the insurance and hospital levels, cost shifting, and the absence of free market principles. He designed his innovation, a very different approach of transparent, direct package pricing so that the patient knows exactly what the cost of the service will be up front. Fees for the surgeon, anesthesiologist, and facility are all included in one low price. There are no hidden costs, charges, or surprises. He went to market with the Surgery Center of Oklahoma, a 32,000 plus square foot state-of-the-art multi-specialty facility in Oklahoma City, owned and operated, that's important as we'll see, by approximately 40 of the top surgeons and anesthesiologists in central Oklahoma. Just assess for a second the innovations we just listed. Not a new way to perform surgery or even to make diagnoses, but innovations in pricing and organization that results in a dramatically improved experience for the customer at a lower cost. A great entrepreneurial mind is at work here. And, as we shall see, that mind is inspired by Austrian economics. Without further delay, let's meet Dr. Keith Smith. He's a board-certified anesthesiologist with a degree from University of Oklahoma School of Medicine, and he holds a fellowship in anesthesiology at the University of Arkansas. He's held several residencies and is most recently the founder of Surgery Center of Oklahoma. Dr. Smith, hello.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
We've got a lot to talk about today in Economics for Entrepreneurs, but here's where I'm going to start. How does an anesthesiologist become familiar with Austrian economics?
Well, you're first victimized by this insane industry I'm part of, and then you look for answers and you try to figure it out. And I seem to have found more answers that made sense in the Austrian school than anywhere else. I first became familiar with the Austrian school from an interview Lou Rockwell gave to a radio host named David Gold in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And I thought he was extremely funny and very dry, very witty, brilliant, good on his feet, and very provocative. And I suppose that was my first exposure. And once I became familiar with Lou, I subscribed to his Rockwell and Rothbard report and met Murray Rothbard through those writings, and then I was off to the races. So much of what goes on in my industry makes absolutely no economic sense, and it's because the government has thwarted markets, and the Austrians, I think, they're the only ones, the disciples of that school, that have ever written or said anything that's helped me make sense of it.
Well, that's a perfect start. Thank you for giving us that launching pad. And I think of Austrian economics, Keith, as the economics of entrepreneurship, and that's where we're going to focus. You're an exemplary entrepreneur. As you said, you've innovated in an industry that typically resists it. You've innovated in pricing and organization and customer experience. You talked to Bob Murphy on his show the other day, and we'll provide a link to that so we can listen to your description of Surgery Center of Oklahoma. But I'd like to keep focus for our listeners on the role that Austrian economics and your absorption of it and application of it has helped you be successful. So let's focus on a few economic principles that you think you've really put to work. And you and I talked a little bit earlier about a top three that you felt had been most helpful. We don't have to limit ourselves to three, obviously, but can you headline or reprise those three for us?
Yes, I think that when I read about the subjective value and what Menger wrote about that, and what Mises wrote about that was really enlightening for me. I had read Bastiat early on, and of course he was a fan of the labor theory of value, and I don't think ever got over that. But I grew up in a house full of musicians and professional musicians, and was a musician myself, and I was around a lot of people that were extremely well trained in their classical music, and they had this flaw in their thinking, looking back, that they were extremely talented, but ultimately knew they would be paid very poorly compared to someone who was not as well trained, but had more of a mass appeal. And this thinking was flawed, because there was no appreciation for subjective value, and what people will pay for something is what they think it's worth, and it's very individualized, and it doesn't just have to do with economics. So this view of subjective value was just radicalizing for me, because it made me actually think, as a physician, who is my customer? Is it the patient? Well, if the patient is not paying me, is it who's paying me? Are they the customer? Is it the big insurance carrier? Who is this? And what's ideal? Should the person that is buying my service, that determines its value, should they decide what my value is worth, or what my service is worth? Should they decide what my service is worth on behalf of, and as a steward of, the actual patient? And then as the Surgery Center of Oklahoma began to materialize, it was clear to me that the surgeons I actually provided service for as an anesthesiologist were also another consumer that actually placed a value, and it was very subjective, on the service that they received. Was it high quality? Was it efficient? Was it safe? Were the patients happy and treated well? And so I began to see my role as an anesthesiologist more properly as a consultant, and providing service to the physician, the surgeon, who was a customer, but also the patients were customers. And I always thought it was cloudy, because it wasn't always the patient that was paying me. Sometimes it was some third party that imposed a price or a fee on the service that I was providing. Many times that fee that was imposed on me was too high, frankly, and most of the time it was too low. And that got me realizing that, if you impose prices on a market, they're always going to be wrong. They're too high, or they're going to be too low, and you're going to have all the predictable surpluses and shortages that result. And much of what's dysfunctional in the industry is because of that very simple economic fact. And it all stems from an understanding, I think, of subjective value. So that was radicalizing for me, to come to grips with this value of this theory of subjective value, and also knowing that some patients, as individuals who buy medical services, they value different things differently. So some people are they're immune to any sort of interest in price. Some people are primarily interested in price. So some people, they'll pay whatever they have to pay to get in today. Some people don't care if they receive their service 6 months from now. Some people want a surgeon or an anesthesiologist who will spend a lot of time with them, and they value that. And some people, they don't care. They just want great service in a hurry, and they don't need much hand holding through the surgical experience. So all of these things, I think, have made me a better physician, and it's made me a more effective manager of the operations at Surgery Center of Oklahoma, because those who are selling services, they actually need to know what it is that the buyers of that service value, and I think it's this subjective theory of value that helped me understand that.
Yeah, that's great advice for entrepreneurs, Keith. We Austrians tend to like to go talk about Karl Menger and the law of marginal utility, but this is about today, and it's about understanding consumer subjective value and your other customers' subjective value, the surgeons you mentioned, and understand that they're all individuals. All value is created inside their minds and their perceptions. They decide what is value. They decide what price they'll pay. And you've figured out a way to listen to that, understand that, and create a new solution that they feel is valuable. So it's a very contemporary way of looking at things. And, you used the word radical, which was wonderful to hear, because there's a lot of research now into radical subjectivism, by which people mean exactly what you said, that we've got to discover the subjective value in every consumer's individual mind and cater to that. And another word I've heard is radical entrepreneurship based on that. So you are a radical entrepreneur, Keith.
Thank you very much. I'm honored.
Well, it's great advice for our listeners. Let us delve a little bit more into that question of who is the customer or who is the consumer. So you said sometimes it's the patient, and they're all different. They have different value hierarchies. And sometimes it's the surgeon or your partner in the business. How do you separate those things? How do you think of that as one process going through the surgeon to get to the patient, or do you treat them differently because it's different parts of your business? Tell us how you sort out that jumble of who's the customer.
Well, it's, I don't know, in the old days, we used to do Boolean searches, and wherever there was an overlap was where all the data came out. If you searched, two different terms, anesthesia and some disease like hypertension, you would wind up with, several articles that had to do with how to administer anesthetics to, very hypertensive people. And it's sort of like that. There's an overlap ultimately where all of the interests of the surgeon and all of the interests of the patient are completely aligned without conflict. And I think what we were able to think through was a way to accommodate all interests with boundaries. There has to be boundaries because there are surgeons who make unreasonable demands, and there are patients, frankly, that make unreasonable demands, and those cannot be accommodated to the extent that the interests of what we believe in our judgment is good care are not obeyed. So I just think about accommodation of preferences, and also many times it's helpful just to make people acknowledge their preferences out loud and make them actually say that and understand their order of preferences, not just what is important to them, but how would you rank those preferences. And ultimately that we end up with, and this sounds very complicated, but it's actually very almost unconscious after you do this for a short period of time, and you realize that everyone's interests have been accommodated, but with boundaries of good judgment, which professionals are supposed to harbor.
Tell us how you do that, Keith. How do you ask the question, what are your values, and how do you rank them, and what do people say when you ask that question? Be interested to get into the details of that.
Well, I've worked with surgeons in the past, for instance, who don't show up on time, or they take a very long time to do a procedure that another surgeon would take a very short amount of time for. With surgeons who just want to go fast, and I don't work with people like that. I mean, you ultimately find out what is important to this surgeon. Is he revenue focused, or is he value focused? Is this somebody who just wants to make money? Is this somebody who in his personal life has preference issues, so that all he really needs to do is do a whole lot of surgery so he can make enough money to pay his mortgage and whatever debt and whatever financial insanity he's encumbered with. So when we get to know you can get to know someone by watching how they act, and many times you can really ascertain what their preferences are by watching how they act. And so the ability to differentiate between a doctor who's very revenue focused, or for that matter, a hospital or a surgery center or whatever that's very revenue focused, is pretty easy to distinguish between that and someone who is truly focused on delivering value. Somebody who has a more long-term view of things, who hopes that every exchange is mutually beneficial. They value their reputation. They want patients to do well. They truly want patients to do well. And it's pretty easy to tell. It's pretty easy to tell early on when we work with a surgeon, or frankly, when we meet a patient that has unreasonable demands. It's very, very easy to understand, what their preferences are, and that we may not be able to accommodate them. As an anesthesiologist, I've had patients tell me that they only want to undergo a surgical procedure under a local anesthetic, and that's completely inappropriate, perhaps, for the surgery that they're about to undergo. And I said, well, we can actually try that, but you need to not tie my hands if in the middle of the procedure you're requesting a general anesthetic, a deeper anesthetic. I need to know that you and I are on the same page, and my hands are not tied, and I can actually give you a real anesthetic, if we get to that point. And some people will say, no, I'm not going to give you that latitude. And so we part ways. And those are the kind of boundaries you discover when you attempt to understand what people's preferences are. Many times people will make demands like that because they're just very fearful, in most of the time, because they're not well informed, and you can inform them and watch their preferences change before your very eyes. So all of these concepts, I think and believe, are very Austrian. And
oh yeah.
And I think about it, when I have these conversations with patients, these are some things that I consider are just very, very powerful gifts that I've received from my reading of the writings of the disciples of the Austrian school. And I'm no economist. I'm a student, but I feel like I have benefited from all of these writings that I've encountered.
So would you advise our listeners that you could actively use these principles of ranked preferences and asking for ranked preferences to choose their team, for example? You said you chose your surgeons and your partners that way. Can they use it to choose the team that they're assembling for their enterprise?
Yeah, I believe you can. Like I said, if someone is acting in a way that may or may not be in the patient's best interest, and it looks like they're just very revenue focused and trying to make all the money they can, I mean, that's not somebody I want to be partners with, because their preferences are completely out of whack if you compare them to what I believe appropriate preferences are, in my judgment, for ultimately good patient care. And for a physician, of all people, to violate non-aggression principle is unforgivable, I believe. So I think you can, over time, get to know people. I think by their order of preferences, I find myself actually seeking that out when I meet new or prospective partners at the Surgery Center of Oklahoma, or other people that I deal with. I want to know, what is important to you, and not just what's important to them, but how do you rank that? I mean, if you had to choose this or that, what would you do? And over time, we get to know our partners, and many times just having this conversation, someone will actually think, well, I've never thought about that. If I had to rank them, what they would be. And so you see individuals, even very highly educated individuals that have not gone through this thought process, begin to evaluate their own ranking of preferences. and that is a very troublesome kind of thought process for some people, and for others it's very enlightening. And so I think it's a very good way to get to know who you're actually making part of your team, who you're working with. And frankly, it's a good way to self-examine and get to know yourself better. I think if you're constantly reevaluating, how would I rank, whatever these preferences are today versus a year ago, or even contemplate how would I rank these preferences 10 years from now, and get a good feel for your own time preference and how it is changing or has changed or may change, and how your own activity and actions in your business may change as a result.
Do you exert or practice that on yourself, Keith? You constantly check your own preference rankings?
I like to think I do. I tell people that Steve Lantier, the fellow that co-founded the Surgery Center of Oklahoma with me, we scour ourselves for inconsistencies, and we're always looking for inconsistencies, and we try to point them out in each other. But we've been at this so long, we really we struggle to find them, but we do find them occasionally where something we're doing kind of doesn't make sense with all the other things we say we believe. And the Surgery Center of Oklahoma is really a manifestation of that. I tell people that when I many years ago thought of myself as a radical free marketer, I had no idea at the time what a socialist I was. And I just began to realize, oh my gosh, no, I'm part of the problem. And the Surgery Center of Oklahoma, part of the reason it opened was our realization that we were actually part of the problem. It's, in spite of all of our, big talking free market, we really hadn't even scratched the surface. We opened in 1997, and we were open for 10 years. And we filed insurance claims, and we, did what everybody else did. And we quoted prices over the phone, which was a really good thing, but we really weren't price transparent. We weren't, showing everybody, in the marketplace, here is who we are, here is what we charge for it, go ahead, market and judge us. And when we finally got to that place where we just put our hat on the peg and said, okay, here is who we are, here's what we do, here is the price we've attached to it, and now we are going to let the marketplace either reward us or crush us. It was at that moment, I believe, that we realized up to that point we had been really not that different from all of the other really socialists that are part of this industry. I believe that was the turning point where we began to truly self-examine, and I believe that even at that point we still had a lot of work and self-examination to do, it's fun. People say, well, how do you know you're on the right road? And I said, well, if it's really hard, then you're probably on the right road. If it's really easy, then you're probably doing the wrong thing, because the medical marketplace is so dysfunctional. If things are going along pretty well, because things are so dysfunctional, it probably means you're in the mainstream, and it's not right. So yeah, that's sort of our self-examination was, I believe, the manifestation of that really is the business that we run.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I just want to make 2 points there for people listening. One is that we say that self-assessment is the first step on the entrepreneurial journey, and I think you're illustrating that. Everybody's got to self-assess, not only at the beginning of the journey, but keep doing that at all points. So thank you for illustrating that. The second point that's salient, obviously, is this is a discovery process, and you said it took 10 years to get to a particular tipping point of discovery, and you made a change at that point. So you're discovering your way into new innovations at all times. Is that still ongoing? You're still discovering new things?
I think I am. I think the rate and the pace of discovery is beginning to level out. I thought I had reached the pinnacle when, in 1993, 3 years after I started practice, I came to the conclusion that to accept money from the federal government meant I was the recipient of stolen property. And so I stopped filing Medicare claims and just cared for the elderly or people covered by Medicare free of charge, because I realized, there's charity, and then there's charity at gunpoint. And then I realized I basically had my neighbor at gunpoint, securing my fees from him for care I was rendering people across town he didn't even know. And most of the time, people who could afford my service. So, in 1993, I actually thought of myself as radicalized and very radical, just because I refused to accept government money, because I saw that as stolen property. And many people would think that's radical, but I was just beginning. That was the tip of the iceberg, where I realized, well, not only is this stolen property, but every single intervention the government has inflicted on this industry has distorted the markets. And so all those interventions have to be examined, and the extent to which I benefit from any of them has to be examined. And I have to expunge myself of all benefit that comes from any of these interventions. And so one thing after another had to be examined. And I think our facility and this entire free market movement that's under the umbrella of the Free Market Medical Association, I think is it's developing and it's progressing, and everybody, I think of people in this movement as training for a marathon, and they're not quite maybe ready to run a marathon, and some of them are going to run a marathon, and there's not going to be any stopping their training, but everybody's just so far along in their journey. And no one should be judged for being only so far along in their journey, as long as they're self-examining, and so my process continues. I think I've read something that and I'm kind of bored with it, and then I think, well, I'll read something else, and I pick up Peter Klein's book, Capitalist and the Entrepreneur, and I think, oh my word. This has got me thinking a whole different way. Or I'll go back and read something Albert J. Nock wrote almost 100 years ago, and it's just jaw-dropping sometimes. So there's just I don't think there's any end to it. And I think when I first started realizing that I was not as radicalized as I thought I was, I found that disturbing and hard to admit. And I think that's human. And now I kind of thirst for it. Now I actually look for something that I can read that changes my mind. And I found myself asking that question to people that I know. What's the last thing you've read that changed your mind? And you can find out in a hurry. Does this person ever change their mind? Do they actually read something that might challenge them? And that tells you a little bit about them too.
Oh, sure. Well, never stop learning. Obviously, that's one of the principles. And dynamic flexibility is the heart of the entrepreneurial thinking of Austrian economics. The environment's always changing. The consumer preferences are always changing. Your creativity can always find new outlets. So that kind of dynamism is exactly right. I'm going to jump onto one more economic principle that you've mentioned, Keith, and just to focus on it for a little bit, and that's time preference, which is, it's one of those technical terms. It's a little bit difficult to understand, but you talked about people having short-term goals versus long-term goals, and preferring revenue now than building their reputation over time, and so on. Entrepreneurs have time preference, where, like you, that it takes some time and some investment and some patience to get the business to the level that that you want to get it to, and that's time preference, having that patience. But I think you see time preference in a broader perspective, what people would give up to be a successful entrepreneur or what they won't forego. And that becomes a kind of another rudder that guides them besides values and preferences. So tell us your thinking about time preference.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. Part of my getting to know somebody that I work with, and part of my own self-exam that goes on all the time, is not just, what are your preferences and how do you rank them, but what opportunities do you see in the marketplace, or what opportunities do you see, what is or is not being provided for patients that's inappropriate, but also what opportunities are you willing to forgo, and that really is, I don't know, in my thinking, that's the essence of entrepreneurism, is that you're willing to forego current opportunities for later benefit. And this concept of time preference, I ran across the concept in Mises, but I didn't really appreciate it, I don't believe, until I read Hoppe's Democracy, the God That Failed. And his discussion of time preference in that book struck me in a way that I'll just be honest, did not strike me when I read it in Mises. And it's probably just because I'm not smart enough to read Mises. But the way Hoppe described time preference was just jaw-dropping for me, because as I looked around the United States, I looked around this area and looked at different business models for physician-owned facilities, whether it's hospitals or surgery centers, time preference was a real factor to be dealt with. And it goes like this. I mean, as surgeons get older, if they are the owners of a medical facility, as they age, they begin to contemplate, how can I monetize my ownership position in this facility? How can I grab the cash and go to the beach? And basically they leave everybody else holding the bag. Venture capitalists will typically buy part of a medical facility that is where the partnership is aging, and the younger partners, are basically left holding the bag because the amount of money that goes into the pockets of the exiting partners is just it's a down payment on advanced earnings that have to be paid back with interest by the remaining partners who are victimized by this. And so time preference helped me understand, that this is an issue as all of these partners of mine age. This is increasingly going to be on their radar, and how do I avoid that? So, brilliant lawyer of mine, he and I had this conversation, and he said, "Well, it's easy." He said, "You just set it up like a law firm," and he said, "That's why this is why lawyers set their firms up this way many times, because they understand property, and they understand property rights, and they understand time preference, frankly." So we set it up so that no partner paid anything to join the Surgery Center of Oklahoma, and no one gets anything, therefore, when they leave. Mm-hmm. And it's a true operating partnership. And there've been, we've been open 22 years now, and I've had numerous instances where one of the aging partners came into my office and said, "Well, don't you think the Surgery Center of Oklahoma has had a good run, and it's time to sell this place?" And I just laugh because I anticipated that conversation, and I tell them that. I said, I am so proud of myself for anticipating this very conversation. And I said, you need to go buy Democracy, the God That Failed by Hans Hoppe, and you will find in there, it will strike you. You will know it when you get to those pages that I anticipated this conversation, and there is no opportunity for you to monetize your position in this facility. Force us to go to the bank, borrow money, to buy out these exiting partners. And so I can't tell you how many times this obeying or at least acknowledging the kind of human behavior component of economics, time preference in particular, and its effect on a partnership has saved the Surgery Center of Oklahoma as a business, and has brought a degree of stability because it has basically defanged an activity that doctors are known for, who are, I would say, doctors as a rule are very fearful. They're not comfortable with uncertainty. They bring the same fear of risk to business ventures they're involved with that they bring to the fear of risk when it comes to patient care, which happens to be very appropriate. But this fear can many times turn someone who is otherwise very long-sighted and long-term thinking into someone with a very high time preference.
Yeah, especially
it can happen. It can happen pretty quickly. Yeah, right. It can happen. It can happen very quickly, almost overnight. So that's one of the greatest gifts that I've received from my reading of the Austrians is the idea of time preference.
Yeah, that's brilliant. You've not only mastered time preference, but you've built a business model and an organizational model around it that's very sustainable. So it's well done. So all of these economic principles and the way you describe them, one way to kind of categorize that is a way of thinking. It's a rigorous way of thinking. It's logical progression. Austrians often call it a priori reasoning, or they like to use the word praxeology, and they're not very helpful to entrepreneurs if you're not doing all the reading that you are. But you've given us a lot of examples. Can you kind of sum up for us the way of thinking that you've now internalized? Is that different than it was 20 years ago? Do you, not just in Surgery Center of Oklahoma, but in your whole approach to commerce and business and life, do you have a different way of thinking?
Yeah, I think I do. I think that for all of the talk of economics and for all of my reading of the Austrians, I think perhaps one of the greatest gifts that I've received is from reading of the Austrians is that everything is not about economics. And again, that comes back to the theory of subjective value. And I think about Albert J. Nock's just a vicious characterization of what he called economism. And I think that the way I think now is very different. It's very respectful of how others value things. And whether it's patients, whether it's my partners, it's just I make fewer assumptions, I think, than I used to. I think I'm a more logical thinker. I think as the managing partner of the Surgery Center of Oklahoma, I think that there is less emotion that's involved in the running of the business. Physicians tend to be emotional people and mostly driven by rage. And fortunately for patients, the rage is against disease and it's against discomfort, and that is all to the benefit of the patients. But many times, this rage is part of how physicians conduct their business. So there's this alternate rage, but also the rage against threats, but also this fear that prohibits physicians from distinguishing many times, I would say, from the difference between risk and uncertainty. And so a reading of the Austrian school writings that I've come across has, I think, allowed me to understand the rage and fear to which I'm exposed. It's allowed me to deal with my own rage and fear, which I believe is a natural part of the training that we all receive in our medical training. And I think it's allowed me to distinguish between risk and uncertainty, and really acknowledge these things and look them in the eye, and so it's not so cloudy with all of these distracting thoughts. I think it's made me a more clear thinker, more clear than I otherwise would be. I don't pretend to be an extremely clear thinker, but I am definitely more clear than I would have been without exposure to these ideas.
Do you have to be a bit of a psychologist? We've talked about understanding others' preferences and values, and you talked about some powerful emotions in others there, like rage. Is the psychology here, or can we stick with economics?
I think so. I think that many times I've had the thought that the study of economics is simply the study of human behavior, but I don't want to discount it too much. I know Peter Klein and others have had some denigrating remarks about, I believe, what people call behavioral economics, and so I think I understand that criticism. I think for the kind of the beginner layman, the doctor, who's beginning to read about these principles, I think it's very natural to think about, Mises, saying, man moves from A to B because he prefers B to A, or he wouldn't move there. I mean, that is basically beginning human behavior that we're taught by psychiatrists in medical school. So I think that it's appealing to think of the study of economics, Austrian economics in particular, as the study really of how economic man acts, and therefore economic human behavior. And so to some extent, I think there is some psychology involved with our own self-examination, certainly interacting with the partners that I have and the people that I've interacted with all through the years. I think it's been good to, and sometimes just get someone to acknowledge that what sort of emotion is on display. I'll ask a patient sometimes, or I'll just acknowledge and tell a patient, you seem really angry, or you seem really scared. And that is surprisingly comforting to someone if you just acknowledge that. I mean, if you say it out loud, and I'll be perhaps having a conversation with one of my partners, and I'll say, you seem very angry or frustrated, and that's a good icebreaker. And then we can have a conversation about, okay, if we need to go from A to B. Let's, agree or disagree on that. But if we agree, let's talk about how do we do that. And so all of those things, I suppose, are psychological, but in another way, they're economic.
Last question for you, Keith. You sound like a confident person, and one of our guests recently, Yusuf Al-Mawayed, said that his study of economics had made him more confident and more decisive in making decisions and taking action. And it sounds like that may be the case for you as well. Did it take a while, or did that come quickly?
I think I am more decisive because of the Austrian school. I think what it has provided me is a lens. That's how I think about this. It has provided me a lens through which to see all that is going on around me differently than I would otherwise. And sometimes, I would say most of the time, that lens provides clarity and obscures all of the distractions. It's very clear to me sometimes when someone is speaking that they are harboring conflicts of interest that I might not otherwise perceive without this lens through which to see them. and to that extent, I suppose it has made me a more confident actor in my environment.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Smith, for all those insights. In my preamble, I mentioned Surgery Center of Oklahoma and its website, and Free Market Medical Association will provide links to those sites. We will provide links to some of the books you mentioned. Is there any other final gift that you'd like to give to our listeners?
No, I'm honored to have had a chance to visit with you, and I hope some of what I've said has helped. I would encourage any physicians that listen to this to avail themselves of any of the books I mentioned and any others that have got any sort of affiliation with the Austrian School. It's been extremely helpful to me. It's been a wonderful gift to me. I think about Lou Rockwell. He wrote an article years ago describing a physician standing in the middle of carnage, and there's just dead bodies all around him, and they've all died of the plague, and everybody is just full of fear and panic, and the physician is the one who has the least fear and panic because he at least understands what's going on. And I think that this understanding that the Austrians have brought me a real calm. I would say not just a decisiveness, but a real. It's just put a real calm feeling on me that I would otherwise not have, and I think a lot of physicians could benefit from some soothing and the understanding that will bring them.
That's a beautiful note to finish on. So let's leave it there. Dr. Smith, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks for having me.
Economics for Entrepreneurs is a production of the Mises Institute. To explore more content like this, visit Mises.org. That's MISES.org. For more from Hunter Hastings, check out hunterhastings.com.